Hello, and welcome to our final section of notes for the week on the Southern Colonies. For the third straight day, we'll be using the same question, just changing out the region of colonies. So how do the physical, cultural, and economic characteristics of the Southern Colonies affect its lifestyle? And by tomorrow, or Friday, you should be able to compare the three regions, tell me the similarities between them, and identify their differences. Finally, you should be able to identify this would be the best region to live in based on its geography. This would be the best region to live in based on how they made their money or economically. So, the Southern Colonies is made up of 5 colonies, unlike the other 2 regions that only had 4. If we start in the north, we have Maryland. Go south, we have Virginia, which was first set up with Jamestown. We have North Carolina, we have South Carolina, and we have Georgia, which would be the final of the 13 colonies. So the climate in the Southern Colonies is way different than the New England or even the Middle Colonies. It's very warm. If you've ever been to the South, you know how warm and hot it can get in the summer. It has a very long growing season because they rarely get snow, and if they do get snow, it doesn't last very long. And it gets warm very quick, so they can grow almost year-round. Not quite, but quite a bit of the year. The soil is extremely fertile. If you remember back to Jamestown, remember how they discovered tobacco grew very well there, and it was because of the soil being so fertile. Other things that grow great in the South were cotton and rice. And the piece of the South that was the most fertile was an area called the Tidewater. This was an area very close to the coast where all the water from the mountains would rush down and the water from the ocean, and it would just bring all the sediment to the region. That sediment made the land much more fertile. If you went up into the hills and into the backcountry of the South, it wasn't as good at farming at this point because this was before irrigation was developed in the region. Culturally, it's in the South where we see the growth of slavery. Yes, slaves will be seen in the Middle Colonies and in the New England colonies, but slavery is where it really takes off. They would develop slave codes, or the laws of how slaves had to obey, and the laws were very harsh towards the slaves, trying to keep them, quote, in their place, or to keep them from trying to revolt. The life was often plantations. Plantations are much larger than a farm. They're enormous pieces of land where thousands of slaves would work, picking cotton or picking tobacco. You would also see in the South the only colony that openly accepted, at first, Catholics, which was in Maryland. Many of the Puritans and other people coming from Europe, they didn't like Catholics and didn't want Catholics in their region. So we'll see them first come to the Maryland area. Maryland will be a very tolerant state when it comes to practicing religion. And finally, an area we'll get into more tomorrow, and we'll talk about more in a second with economics, is triangle trade. So economically, if you remember to Jamestown, they made lots of their money selling and growing tobacco. They also did this with rice and cotton, all cash crops that they could just sell and sell because they could grow so much. The reason they had to have plantations, though, is because tobacco just kills the land, and if you grow on it every single year, the land will just wear out and it won't grow anymore. So on a plantation, instead of the small farms that you would see in the New England and Middle Colonies, they could cut off part of the land and not grow anything on it for a year, and then the rest of their plantation is growing it, and then they would rotate which piece of land is not growing any tobacco or cotton that year, to constantly renew the soil. As I said, we need to talk about triangle trade. The South made their money selling cotton and rice and tobacco off to other countries, specifically in Europe. So, as you see in this picture, you see a triangle set up. Europeans would go into Africa. They would get and sell goods to Africa, such as arms and rums and textiles or clothes. From there, they would get slaves. They would ship them to the Americas. The Americans would buy the slaves for their plantations. They would use the slaves to pick their cotton, pick their tobacco, harvest it, get it ready to sell, and then they would sell those goods off to Europe. And it was just a constant cycle of Europe would finish the product, they would sell it to Africa for slaves, the slaves would get sent to America to get new raw product, send it back to Europe, they would take the cotton, make textiles, and it was just a continual triangle that rapidly expanded slavery in America. As you can see in this picture down here, this would be a slave boat that they would travel from Africa to America in. Very tight, these people are laying down shoulder to shoulder. They didn't have much space. They were forced into very small quarters and very poor living conditions for that trip across the ocean. Again, we'll look at this a little bit more tomorrow, but the economics of the South depended on triangle trade, tobacco, and cotton and rice. Those are very important to know for our upcoming test. So, again, think about how the Southern Colonies compared to the Middle Colonies compared to the New England Colonies. In a week, we will have a test over these three regions. Whatever you can pull in from Jamestown, which I mentioned a little bit tonight, or whatever you can pull in about Plymouth and the Pilgrims into the New England region to describe the physical, cultural, or economic characteristics would work perfectly for this test. We will review next week, and we'll start our project next week where we'll get into more detail into the individual colonies themselves based on whatever one you receive for the project. Have a good evening.